Do you mind asking me to say something?
Yeah, Yuri, can you try and say something so we can hear?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you? No?
Should I take this off? No.
Was there a paper sheet?
Oh,
No.
strange.
Oh, okay.
What about if you try now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, no, I
No?
can't even hear you through my own.
Yeah. I think it was working before you started sharing the screen.
Okay, this is weird. Because external. Oh, right. So that disappeared because you unplugged.
Right.
And then
No, it's not working. Should I say something?
Yeah, this should work. I can also.
No?
Yeah, well, if we can't hear it because what will my presentation? Oh, did my presentation go away?
Oh, you can just I need to go to Windows. Are you using PowerPoint?
Yeah. Okay, so if I go.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah, see, now we can't hear the presentations either.
Yes, let me ask.
Can you hear me? No?
And Yuri says she doesn't see my slides. My shared screen is just black.
I think your screen sharing is paused because we're now on the Zoom window. So
Resume share.
yeah.
Oh, thanks.
No.
No, apparently it's still black. The tech is just so confusing.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I can hear you well, Yuriko.
Oh, so you hear me? Yeah. Somehow Krista
yeah, I
can't
was-
hear us.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now, Krista? No, I guess not. No. Oh yeah.
Oh, look at
Yes. Now we see it.
So they can now see it,
Mhm.
but they can't. I can't hear them. Can you?
No? Can you
Can you
hear?
hear me?
No? Yeah, yeah.
They can hear me, but I can't hear them, and they can't hear, and people in the room can't hear the
I'm
slides.
sure it's just the wrong audio input, so it's.
I did put it to external headphones.
Oh, okay, that's. Someone speaking on there that isn't.
Okay, should I say something?
Yuri, can you say
No?
something again?
Yeah, I'm saying something.
Yeah. Take a look at the.
Can you hear me? Can...
Sound settings. Yes. Oh, there you go. Okay, perfect.
That's what I thought.
They could hear me probably through my.
Let's try this one. All right. And if someone could unmute and try to speak again, I believe. Eureka
Yes,
can.
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
This is bizarre.
No?
Let's try it
Okay.
without this plugged in. See if we.
Can you try again without the,
Yeah, okay.
I can't even do that.
Oh, why is that? Can't turn up the volume.
No?
Try changing it to speakers.
Okay, can you try and say something now, Yuri?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Isn't it
Can
bizarre
you
how
hear?
something here is just the volume? Yeah.
Okay.
Something.
Isabel,
Connected.
do you wanna try? Maybe like, I don't know if it's something with me or,
No,
Yeah.
Yeah,
now,
I can hear you very well.
Go ahead.
yeah. Okay, so I guess it's just on the other side.
okay, try again. We heard you on through my speakers.
Yeah, okay.
No, see-
No.
Oh, yes, yes, there we got it. We
Yeah?
got it. We got it. We got
Oh,
it.
great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Ah,
Thank you,
oh my
Krista.
goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, I'll rely on you to help me out if things start to look weird on the
Sure, yeah. I can mute myself now.
this has been like, yeah, this has been the theme of this conference. Okay, well, why don't we get started now that we finally worked out now that we finally worked out the tech. It's okay. Aloha, my name is Crystal Lines. I'm a guest on this ANA, here to hold a conversation today with some friends and colleagues around the politics of waste. I trace my family roots to Southern French and Italian and British and Scottish peoples with immediate ties to France and to Turtle Island, where I live and work as a white settler on the unceded lands of the Ganyangahaga Nation in Jojage. I'm non-binary and queer. I use they, them pronouns. And I want to acknowledge that the ANA on which we gather here in Honolulu is part of the larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral grandmother, Papahano Moku. The Hawaiian kingdom was yielded under duress and protest, and Hawaii is an illegally occupied state of America. And I want to name also the US's complicity in the unimaginable violence and genocide on occupied land that's taking place right now in Palestine, and to speak my unnameable grief and rage as bombs fall on Gaza. I'm also grateful to be received by this land, its air, its water, its sun, its human and more than human life and spirits and histories. And I recognize that generations of Indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge system shaped Hawaii in sustainable ways that allow those of us who traveled here to receive the gifts of this place. And I want to acknowledge the tourist and military industries that have appropriated this land as a resource for extraction and waste. Our panelists are joining us from Zoom, and while Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which some of us gather, it makes us no less occupants of unceded Indigenous land. And Zoom itself is a product of Silicon Valley, whose headquarters are located on Muwekma Ohlone territory. So I'm going to begin with my paper and then queue up all the 4 virtual papers. Isabel, I haven't had a chance to test yours, so be ready if it doesn't work in my thing to go live with it, and we'll try and work with that. And at the end, I'm going to ask my co-panelists to join me via Zoom for a conversation and question and answer session. Okay, let's see if I can get this working. Great. So my paper today is called Infrastructures of Wasting. It's part of a larger project that is focused on contemporary commercial greenhouses and tries to see them as a kind of emergent form of what some have called the Plantationocene. So it focuses on greenhouses as this kind of significant landscape form, and a significant landscape form of intensive capitalist agriculture, one that has really profound racialized and gendered effects, tied also to forms of reproductive normativity. So today I want to focus on Almeria in southern Spain, which is the site of my current case study research. And this research is really still in its early stages. I will likely have more to say about it after a field trip in spring of 2024. So note that I'm thinking with the specificity of this site, but in a really preliminary and tentative way. So Almeria is a condensed landscape of late capitalist intensive agriculture that's been called a sea of plastic. It's 40,000 hectares of greenhouses, the largest concentration in the world. And it's interesting because greenhouses are often seen as sites of abundance, agricultural abundance, growth possibilities, flourishing, right? And particularly necessary in the face of population growth and the volatility of climate change. But what I'm proposing today is to see them as infrastructures of wasting. This image actually comes from NASA sensor data, and they were using new satellite technologies that allowed them to take pictures that would like cross spans of like 200 kilometers, but still keep the resolution. And that was really important for understanding the topography of different landscape forms so that you could get kind of the landscape of urban forms, forests, suburban sprawl. And the image of the greenhouses that are so sprawling that you can see them from space became this kind of imaginary of environmental destruction, because as you can see, the whole of southern Spain is covered with the white plastic sheeting of the greenhouses. So the metaphorics of a sea of plastic are those of waste and disposability, but the landscape simplification at play here is deeper than this. And the plastic sheeting that's blanketing this area, I think, is a kind of spectacular object, one with an elastic set of metaphors. But what it covers over are the uneven conditions of livability taking place beneath it. And I want to think about processes of wasting of human and non-human worlds, life worlds, to understand how this sea is bound up with land appropriation and resource extraction and monocrop planting and labor exploitation. And so with these broader structures of valuation and devaluation that are really constitutive of racial capitalism and ecological destruction. So first, I just want to, for terminological sakes, I want to kind of distinguish between waste and wasting. And I think both are really at play in the sea of plastic. The greenhouse obviously absolutely produces waste in the form of contaminations of fertilizers and pesticides, water and energy expenditures and plastics. But I'm looking to Max Liboron and Joshua Lepowski's definition of wasting, to pay attention to how some materials, practices, regions, and people are valued and devalued. And one of the things that they argue is that wasting is a technique of power, this kind of lever for sapping value and occupying land non-reciprocally. So wasting points to what must be discarded. And by discarded, I mean both thrown away, but also exhausted, depleted, sapped of energy for this or that system to be created and to carry on. And so what's central to the argument I'm laying out today is a kind of energetic and material laying to waste of plants and peoples and lands and water. And in the larger research project from which this is drawn, greenhouses are understood as a kind of phenomenologically marked sites of heightened sensibility for thinking about the multi-species histories that constitute intensive agriculture. And I argue that they're a form of media insofar as they compress time and space like time-based media do, and they draw from vital energy of plants and laborers pressed into the kind of condensations of yield. And so I'm allying my work with folks like Sarah Sharma, who argue that media are implicated in a politics of time that's uneven and steeped in gendered, sexualized, and racialized structures of power. So greenhouse structures is what I'm arguing in this project have been instruments in this politics of wasting, right? Particularly as they've transformed over time through processes of modular simplification And these processes are really thoroughly embedded in global agribusiness technology. So what you see on the top, type A, was the first kind of greenhouses. These are the greenhouses that were really constitutive of small family farms, where the labor force was mostly the farm grower's family. And they were mostly wooden posts with very thin plastic sheeting put on top. As the greenhouse area increased, the B-type greenhouse, which is now known as the Almeria greenhouse, was developed, and that's the thing that really sprawled the kind of patchiness of the sea of plastic. And there they were using these kinds of tubes and iron infrastructure that was used for actually growing table grapes. So they were for trellising table grapes, and they used that kind of infrastructure with this plastic sheeting over top of it. But recently, multi-span greenhouses have been imported into southern Spain, and these are the ones that you see at the bottom. And these greenhouses are more water and airtight. They have a better control of climate inside. They're more diaphanous, and all of this favors the mechanization of the crop and the ability to install auxiliary elements into them for climate control. So they're really mostly imported from places like the Netherlands and Hungary and other cold climates, but into Spain to standardize the kind of practices of industrial agriculture. So this increasing simplification makes them into a global form, I'm arguing, kind of like a shipping container, right? That moves these technologies and these agricultural practices and this intellectual property and monocrop plant life itself right around the world in this kind of contained and modular shape, in the way that Amit Singh and others have called modular simplification, right? It's a unit that then can be moved around the world and can produce this kind of patchy intensity. So what the transformation of the greenhouse tracks is this intensification of global agribusiness models in the region and the insertion of Almeria into transnational exchange circuits. And one of the things that I think is important is that the sea of plastic extends from and expands beyond the greenhouse. So we have to think about the transnational circuits of plastic that come to land in Almeria in the greenhouse. The sheeting that covers them is supposed to last 4 years, but about half of it has to be replaced every year. So you imagine how much plastic waste then gets discarded, often ends up in the Ramblas, and then ends up in the Mediterranean Sea, right? But this plastic also extends to the precarious housing structures that shelter migrant workers, and they live in the interstices of the greenhouse patchwork. So the plastic is continuous across the spaces of growing and the spaces of labor's housing. It's in the seedling trays that are used to plant the crops, and in the packing material that's used to ship them across Europe, and then in the containers of fertilizers that then get reused very often, because the precarious housing doesn't include services like running water. People reuse fertilizer tubs, and then it makes them sick, right? So I'm arguing that this insertion of Almeria's agricultural ecology into the landscape form of global intensive greenhouse agriculture buttresses its politics of infrastructural wasting. So to increase yield, they often rely on a reserve of offshore laboring bodies, many of whom cross the Mediterranean despite the violence of the border politics of Fortress Europe. This offshore storehouse of labor draws from and depletes diverse forms of life and labor around the world to produce monocrop tomatoes in the wrong time, in the wrong place. Governed by a temporal and spatial dynamics of being both offshore and off-season, right? Like, why do we need to eat tomatoes in winter? We need to eat tomatoes in winter, and then what kinds of storehouses of labor and energy do we need to draw from to grow those tomatoes in winter, offshore and off-season? And this greenhouse proliferates a host of negative affects and injuries that are profoundly racialized as a point of politics of wasting. So beyond the administrative violence that makes people illegal, workers are subject to the atmospheric violence brought on by the modular simplification of the sea of plastic. So laborers working in the greenhouses work in an atmosphere that's actually regulated for growing greenhouse vegetables. So not really fit for human laborers who end up suffering from heat stress and thermal stress, particularly in peak summer hours where sometimes temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. And what you see here is this study of musculoskeletal disorders that are a result of the labor of working in greenhouses, of stretching while harvesting the fruit, leaning during sowing to remove weeds, collecting products from shorter plants, lifting and transporting heavy loads, operating machines, driving long distances, performing jobs that require pulling and pushing. All of these cause musculoskeletal distress, especially through the repetitive time of these really long work days with no overtime. So there isn't a work day and then overtime, all time is labor time potentially. And during times of peak harvest and planting, those times can extend through the day and night, right? So the wasting enacted by the greenhouse's compression of time and space is coextensive with the global distribution of labor and the outsourcing and insourcing flows emerging from colonial geopolitics and biocapital, something that Kalindi Vora calls the investment of human energy in other bodies. So what I argue in an article that I wrote in Configurations is that the transfers of vital energy move from the soil, the air, the sun, laboring bodies into the produce in a kind of ripening time that's loosed from circadian rhythms and loosed out onto the greenhouse floor. And this energy is then implanted into vegetables grown in the greenhouse and ultimately transferred into the human energy of other bodies as sustenance, those who eat them, right? So the greenhouse's compressions enact this differential process of growing, thriving, and wasting simultaneously. But even the produce itself as a forced crop is also wasting as it yields more and more. So a third of the crops in Almeria's greenhouses are tomatoes, and tomatoes are a crop that generates the most losses across their life cycle. They're called a thirsty and frail crop. So a third of the tomatoes that are grown are lost in the production and processing stages. And then these losses pile up as they're transported for sale across Europe. And finally, and this is really striking, food losses during final use in households across Europe are the largest single loss. So 13.5% of the total food loss is actually the food rotting on the kitchen counter in houses around Europe. So what this means is that the kind of logic that we need this kind of intensive agriculture to feed a growing population is actually belied by the consumer who lets the tomato rot, right? After all this energy and labor has already been accumulated in the fruit itself, the energy becomes expended, spent, discarded, and unconsumed. So Anat Singh argues that we must both at once acknowledge catastrophe and imagine possibility. And I think it's really important to imagine possibilities because when I was looking at the technical and agricultural and environmental literatures, experts are already imagining possibilities also for sustainable futures within the framework of growth and the intensification of greenhouse agriculture. So there are lots of schemas that look like this. Right. And they work from the presumption that we need sustainable food production and consumption because we have greater food demand, which means we need intensive agricultural practices. And the greenhouses have been actually really good in providing abundant, cheap, and high quality product. And they use resources like water, minerals, and pesticides with very high economic efficiency. And often what this means in the literatures is that they want to institute the very practices responsible for human and more than human wasting more efficiently, right? So incorporating ICTs into production, better marketing and quality control and product safety. And some of these do kind of green economies and render processes more efficient and do things like reabsorb waste as bioenergy. But while it addresses waste, it doesn't and it can't address the broader processes of wasting the greenhouse enacts because it's all organized within a capitalist framework, right? So what I'm arguing is that we have to imagine possibilities because sustainability programs are imagining possibilities too. And this means questioning the form that holds these fields together. So I'm relying again on Liboiron's assertion that land can sustain alternative worldviews and that these worldviews can challenge the practices of human and more than human wasting at play in plantation landscapes. And I don't want to call for a kind of false radicalism or deny that we need technological innovations to find our way to food security. Obviously, with climate change and drought cycles in Almeria will become more frequent and water more scarce and rainfall slighter, and there will be higher atmospheric evaporative demands on the climate with increased temperatures. But it means also remembering that Almeria wasn't always a sea of plastic and that it was a key node in the commercial paths of the Phoenician exchanges across the Mediterranean. During the Crusades, when populations withdrew or were driven out of the area, the land proliferated plant cover and wild fauna. Bear and roe deer and red deer and lynx lived in Almeria. The ground was covered in savanna-like vegetation with dense bushes and small Aleppo pine woods. So imagining possibilities means affirming that land never settles, right, in Liboiron's terms. It means affirming relations between material aspects, histories, kinships, events, accountabilities, human and non-human species. It needs local and particular knowledge, not a greenhouse form, migrating as an industrial assemblage across spaces of intensive agricultural formation. So imagining possibilities means allying with the solidarity of strikes. And this is a strike that was performed following this incredible racial violence in El Ejido in 2000, where Moroccan workers who were the targets of the violence were accompanied in solidarity by West African workers to organize an indefinite strike. And they congregated at the doors of the police station to protest the racial violence that they endured. And they were successful in paralyzing agricultural production in the area, and the daily losses were more than 70 million pesetas a day. And they were successful in 2 weeks in coming to an agreement to respond to the demands of the agricultural workers. So this capacity for striking and the imaginary of going on strike, like what Ariella Azalea calls imagine going on strike, is a potent force for resisting the wasting of vital energy that the greenhouse extracts. And I want to end with an image of a wild asparagus sprout. This plant sprouted at the foot of an almond tree on a small farm designed to find new agricultural practices to counter encroaching desertification and soil erosion. So this is part of a movement for regenerative agriculture that aims to revitalize local landscapes. And the wild asparagus sprout is a sign that the farm strategies to counter erosion are working. And so I'm thinking about, with Anna saying about politics of weediness and how that weediness might be enacted in the gaps in processes of modular simplification that are exemplified by the greenhouses in the sea of plastic. This weedy patchwork, often emerging in the ruins of corporations and plantations, points us towards a kind of weedland politics. And so I'm kind of interested in this productive remainder of the weedland, spaces that come to be understood as undercultivated or underused or unproductive or wasted. And so I'm saying the wild asparagus might point us to existing broader politics of undercultivation rather than intensive production, not in the sense of reneging on food security or abundance, but in the sense of a kind of insurgent agricultural undercommons that involves real and substantive food sovereignty. And that's the end of my paper. The next paper that we will hear is from Yuriko Furuhata, who is Associate Professor and William Dawson Scholar of Cinema and Media History in the Department of East Asian Studies at McGill University. She's the author of Cinema of Actuality and Climactic Media, which came out in 2022 with Duke University Press. And she's currently working on a new book project titled The Edges of Deep Time, which explores scientific photographs and films of fossils, clouds, snow, and coral as storage media in relation to the settler colonial histories of geosciences in Japan, the Pacific, and North America. And I'm going to cue up this presentation.
And I am presenting and the pre-recording the talk titled Evaluated Coral and Seabird Experiment, Waste and Nuclear Ecologies in the Pacific. So in this talk, I want to approach ecologies of waste through the intertwined history of coral reef science and resource extraction in the Pacific. My argument is that the extraction of resources always accompanies an extraction of knowledge and vice versa. So I will be focusing on a set of images for the photoradiographs, which are produced by evaluated coral specimens that American scientists collected in the aftermath of the nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands in the 1950s. Through the mediation of these scientific images, I want to connect the issue of nuclear waste to the colonial history of coral reef science. More specifically, I want to explore how this moment of American imperialism opens up to a longer history of extracting mineral resources in the Pacific, where multiple empires, including that of Japan, competed to exert their influence and claim ownership over the islands. To do so, I am going to draw a conceptual parallel between two kinds of waste collection or extraction. First, the collection of irradiated coral specimens whose bodies absorb the radioactive waste released by nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. And second, the sedimented excrement of sea bars or guano, which were mined on other Pacific islands to be used as natural fertilizer. I argue that the involuntary labor of irradiated coral and other marine organisms used to make these scientific images needs to be analyzed alongside the involuntary labor of indentured, guano, and phosphate miners, whose freedom was curtailed by colonial regimes of Asia. By taking this detour through the history of the indenture, I want to show how the production of scientific knowledge operates as another form of extraction. So let me start with a brief history of coral reef science and its intersection with the field of nuclear ecology, or what is called radiation ecology. Perhaps many of you are already familiar with the work of Mediating Ecologies, Howard Odom and Wilson Odom, two brothers who conducted their field work in the Marshall Islands to study the impact of nuclear coral. But what is often overlooked is the preceding work of Japanese marine biologists who are operating within the bounds of the Japanese Empire. Their work on the symbiotic relationship between coral and algae was also integral to the development of the field of coral science. In fact, the Odom brothers drew on the earlier work of Japanese coral reef scientists who worked at the Palau Botanical Station in the occupied island of Palau in the 1930s and 1940s. Located in today's Republic of Palau, this Japanese research facility holds an important place in the colonial history of coral reef science. The first thing to note about Palau is its location. Between 1914 and 1945, the Japanese Empire occupied the former Diamond Micronesian colonies of the Palau, Caribbean, Mariana, and Marshall Islands under the League of Nations mandate. In case you are not familiar with this history, I am putting up a 1921 National Geographic map, which shows the territorial coverage of Japan's colonial rule over these southern Pacific islands. Now, as part of its bid to raise the international profile, Japan established its first scientific research laboratory to study coral reefs in Palau while using its settler colonial presence in the southern Pacific to expand its geopolitical influence and access to mineral resources, such as non-mineral and phosphate coral. It was within this historical context that Japanese scientists began studying coral reef ecology and the symbiosis between coral and algae. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the United States took over the control of these islands, including the Marshall Islands, which the US military subsequently used as its ending site for nuclear weapons during the Cold War. So I have this image from one of the publications that Japanese follow scientists were putting together in 1937, and they were originally used both in Japanese and English. So I have it here. Between 1946 and 1955, the US military detonated 67 nuclear weapons on the outposts of these islands, Marshall Islands. In the wake of this extraordinary destruction caused by nuclear testing, including the devastating irradiation and forced displacement of the indigenous countries' people, American scientists flocked to these islands for research. And these scientists included the Odin brothers who treated the irradiated atolls of the Marshall Islands as one of the primary sites of their ecological field work. They examined the environmental impact of radiation. And through their research on the symbiotic relationship between coral ecology and the metabolic conception of the irradiated coral reef as a closed ecosystem, they helped develop the field of ecosystem ecology. And again, the work of Japanese scientists like Howard Shishiro, who was studying this symbiotic relationship, was one of the references for the brothers. Now, to trace the spread of radiation, the scientists used photoradiography. Photoradiography is a uniquely camera-less image-making technique, and radioactive materials are placed on the surface of photosensitive plates to make these black and white images. Its history goes back to 1896, when Henri Becquerel, a French physicist, placed a piece of uranium salt on the glass plates coated with photosensitive emulsions to visualize the ionizing radiation from the fire. He then created a photolithographic copy from this glass negative, and here's an example of this photolithographic copy of its radioactive uranium salt. This image, this method of image making was also used by the brothers. So in the immediate aftermath of the devastating nuclear process in the Marshall Islands, they examined the coral and algae specimens taken from the irradiated corals. It's a kind of complex process. I'm not going to go into it, but by taking these images, they were able to prove that a symbiotic relationship between coral and algae lived inside them, which remained until then more of a consequence. Now, to be sure, the organs were not the only scientists who used the photoradiography. So, for instance, Japanese scientists collected radioactive objects from a irradiated Japanese fishing boat, which was contaminated by the fallout from the 1954 nuclear weapons test between Atoll, and used the same technique to visualize and measure the extent of radioactive contamination. And here I have some images from the scientific papers published by these Japanese scientists. So they, you can see the image of the radioactive blob and also the hemp pictures. Now, other American scientists, such as Kensho Lona at the Laboratory of Radiation Biology at the University of Washington, also turned to this technique to study the growth rate of marine organisms, such as giant crab. Following Barnum's work, scientists at the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics at the University of Hawaii also used photoradiography to study the growth rate of irradiated coral in the early 70s. So I have all these images, but I'm gonna now think a little bit more, conceptually and theoretically about these images. What I want to do is to interpret this image-making process mediated by radioactive materials such as irradiated coral specimens as a form of involuntary labor that contributed to the production of scientific knowledge. And to do so, I draw on the work of environmental humanities scholars who have urged us to take seriously the role of non-human agents in the production of knowledge. For instance, in her analysis of the autoradiograph used by American scientist, environmental historian Laura Martin has argued that the very idea of ecosystem associated with the field of radiation ecology emerged out of an assemblage of multiple actors, including scientific instruments and specimens. Martin writes, and I quote, "The activities of non-humans at different scales enabled ecosystems to materialize." End quote. To think about the roles of faith and of non-humans in scientific practice, he continues is therefore to insist on the material exchanges and interactions among human and non-human actors. Similarly, Elizabeth Johnson uses the conceptual framework of labor to discuss the work of animals and plants whose biosensing capacities are harnessed and commodified by the human-made bioeconomy. Johnson suggests that the agent of the economic value creation and the transformation of the world has always been more than human. And Johnson writes, and I quote, "What horses, oxen, mules, bees, and so on help and do work alongside the living labor of humans." End quote. Other scholars such as Brett Clark, Richard York, and John Bellamy Foster have also analyzed the world transforming work of non-human actors, such as earthworms, as a form of ecological labor. Now, while this expansion of the concept of labor to include non-human actors allows us to be attentive to the interspecies relations and go beyond anthropocentrism, I also want to note that we need to be careful, or we need to make sure not to flatten the history of human labor as we apply this concept to non-human agents. For the concept of labor is historically inseparable from what critical theorist Lisa Lowe has called the racialized distribution of freedom and humanity. By this phrase, Lowe reminds us that how the liberal humanist understanding of personhood and therefore humanness was defined through one's access to different degrees of freedom associated with labor, right? So enslaved African and indigenous peoples in the Americas were therefore excluded from the political arena of claiming liberal personhood and humanity precisely because their labor was considered to be unfree. Introduced as a new system of providing cheap labor in the wake of the abolition of transatlantic slavery, the racialized indentured labor of Asians and Pacific Islanders also positioned these workers as partially or conditionally free. Their claim to humanity was therefore conditional. So given this fraught history of liberal humanism, labor, and freedom, I want to take caution in expanding the pyramid of labor to discuss the work of non-human agents and highlight the involuntary nature of their labor. That is to say, I want to acknowledge the incapacity of coral to fully consent to offer their labor in the production of scientific knowledge. And I will come back to this point more in detail shortly. But for now, I want to go back to the history of human labor. Now, one of the areas where indentured human labor was needed was the mining of mineral resources such as guano and phosphate ore. Dubbed as white gold, guano was highly sought after resources by the Euro-American colonialists in the 19th century. It was prized as a very effective fertilizer. So the fight for this mineral led to many territorial conflicts and the conquest of many islands. Other colonial forces, including the Japanese Empire, also rushed to claim islands in the Pacific in the late 19th and early 20th century for the very same reason. To dig guano and phosphate ore, a number of indentured workers were brought from China, British Malaya, and various Pacific islands to places such as Panama and Angola. Palada Island, which is located in today's Republic of Palau, was the most lucrative site of phosphate mining under the Japanese and first the German and then the Japanese colonial regimes. Many of the workers were forced to sign contracts under duress, even though the Japanese Empire aimed or pretended that workers freely consented to work in these mines, their labor was in fact or involuntary. So with this history of the involuntary labor of mineral resource mining in mind, I now want to return to the non-human labor of radioactive specimens. Intriguingly, the scientists have described autoradiographs produced by these specimens as self-portraits. The irradiated coral and other specimens are said to take their own pictures. Take, for instance, the caption included in the book Operation Crossroads, the official pictorial record published in 1946 by the Joint Task Force 1. It reads, and I have a quote up here, it reads, quote, "These radio autographs are made by placing the subjects on a photographic film overnight. They suggest Becquerel's 1896 discovery of radioactivity when he left near some uranium bearing pitchblende, or similarly took its own picture on a piece of film." End quote. Both phrases, self-portrait and took its own picture, suggest a certain degree of agency and a capacity for asserting selfhood by these specimens, right? The very adjective self, to talk about the autoradiographs of irradiated animals and plants, gives the impression that they consented to willingly take their own pictures. Implied by the phrase self-portrait is an assumed free will to participate and with consent, right? To participate in the process of image making and by extension in the scientific knowledge production. However, these images are obviously produced by non-consenting agents who were collected and extracted as sample specimens by the scientists. The adjective auto to describe autoradiography then is not associated with selfhood, but rather with automaticity, the mechanical procedure of doing away with the camera, and I would say doing away with free will. The irradiated object automatically leaves its radioactive traces onto the exposed X-ray films. To call these images self-portraits, then, is to obscure the violence of their original exposure to radiation and to the fact that their participation in the process of knowledge production was involuntary. I highlight this involuntary nature of the non-human labor of irradiated specimens such as those of reef-building coral because this allows me to also dig deeper into the entangled histories of colonialism and coral reef science. I also foreground the example of coral specimens in this talk since reef-building coral, equivalent of the depth we can see, has historically been associated with the image of industrialness and hard labor. More than any other marine organisms, coral has been anthropomorphized through the analogy of labor. For instance, Charles Darwin celebrated the construction of majestic reefs by coral polyps, affectionately calling them the rock architects. In his 1839 journal, chronicling his voyage on the ship Beagle, Darwin praises of, and I quote, the accumulated labor of millions of architects at work night and day, months after months, end quote. Coral polyps, in his eyes, were hard-working reef builders whose collective labor to build islands is comparable to the work of human architects. Now, taken in isolation, Darwin's praise may seem innocuous, right? He's just praising these little animals as hard-working architects. But this anthropomorphized image of a hard-working coral was rooted deeply in the colonial context of the British Empire. In the 19th century, Britain seized many of the Pacific islands and sent Christian missionaries and settlers to colonize these islands. As Hide Juria, Kawaki Parker, Hal Klein, Howard, and others reminds us, these civilizing missions were the indispensable tools of settler colonialism, Moreover, as Michelle Ellery argues in her analysis of the Christian missionary literature, the liberal Victorian virtue of industrialness embodied by coral came to symbolize, quote, the agrarian community of European colonialists, end quote, who justified their settlement as a divine mission to civilize the uncivilized. So Darwin's praise for the wonderful labor of coral therefore needs to be read through the mediation of this Victorian imaginary of white European settlers as industrious builders. Today we continue to associate coral with labor as the colloquial use of the term reef building coral to describe hard-shelled coral polyps indicates. But what is forgotten and obscured by this colloquial phrase is the history of reef building coral, which served as an exemplary figure of industrialness and civilization associated with settler colonialism in the Pacific. To conclude, I suggest that the ecologies of nuclear waste and organic waste, such as the experimental bars that turn into mineral resources, need to be interrogated together. By reading these two ecologies of waste together, we can trace the colonial roots of coral reef science and its importance to the development of radiation ecology as a field of science. As I have argued, what binds these two ecologies of waste is the history of involuntary labor performed by racialized human workers whose claim to freedom was curtailed by the colonial regime of extraction, and the involuntary labor of non-human specimens who participated in the production of scientific knowledge without consent. When we examine these two forms of involuntary labor together, I think we can better understand the insidious process of transforming waste into a source of wealth, be it the figurative wealth of scientific knowledge or the literal wealth of financial gains. However, the violence behind this process is often obscured and forgotten, just like the pervasive yet invisible presence of anthropogenic radiation in the Pacific Ocean left from the Cold War era of nuclear weapons testing that continue to affect island nations and indigenous communities, and how these are too often overlooked today. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuri. I'm so sorry that the sound wasn't great for those folks on Zoom. And thank you, Isabel, for letting me know that. It's good in the room. That was a really fascinating presentation on involuntary labor across human and non-human species and its effects on colonial appropriation and extraction ecologies. It was really beautiful. There. So our next presenter is Stina Atterbury, who's a lecturer in interdisciplinary studies at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She's published in American Quarterly, Medical Humanities, Extrapolation, and Humanimalia, and contributed to collections on gender and environment in science fiction, cyberpunk and visual culture, and the Routledge Companion to Cyberpunk Culture. She serves as the division head for film and television for the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts, and as an external editorial board member for studies in the fantastic.
So I've been writing about pollution in science fiction for a few years now. And when talking with Lisa Hahn about ocean trash, she recommended a comic.
Sorry, that's not what I want to do.
If you're not familiar, the comic is a science fiction story about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I'm interested in science fiction texts which position waste itself as a politically transformative space for future life, especially when that future life is strangely mutated. So science fiction comic books about such a high-profile site for Anthropocene trash should be right up my alley. I'll be talking about the comic today, but what I found is that Great Pacific, the comic, is garbage. The dialogue is poorly written, the comic is episodic to the point of incoherence, there are plot threads that appear and disappear without resolution, the art style is ugly, it's shockingly racist and sexist, and shocking for a comic that came out in 2012, because it's racist in a very retro way. I'm not surprised to see racism in a comic book, but the way it's racist really surprised me. The comic is only 18 issues, and each one is a real slog to get through. With all that in mind, I am finding Great Pacific, the comic, very productive to think about, so thank you, Lisa, for putting it on my radar. Because its awfulness is revealing of the ways that capitalism positions toxic matter as a space for both speculative innovation and colonial control. The comic represents the complex trash ecologies of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as a profitable problem, one which shores up white colonial masculinity by providing a new trash frontier, which the marketing for the comic calls Earth's newest, strangest frontier, as a setting for a pulpy science fiction adventure story. For my talk today, I'm going to focus primarily on the comic series with an eye to the way that it uses genre to make pollution cleanup efforts into a new colonial project. After all, one of the blurbs from the first edited and collected volume calls Great Pacific a perfect science fiction story. In my larger project, I'm interested in bringing this comic into conversation with other representations of ocean waste as a speculative frontier, particularly the mini-game Flotsam, a post-apocalyptic city-building game set in a trash ocean. For today, I will gesture at Flotsam, but I'm mostly going to focus on Great Pacific. So, what does perfect science fiction look like? Well, meet the incredibly irritating protagonist of the comic, Chaz Worthington III, a third-generation heir to a Texan oil family. The comic is his coming-of-age story across 3 sections. There's a man versus nature survival story where he first arrives at the patch, complete with pirates, a mutant octopus, and hostile natives. There's a nation-building project, which mostly happens off-panel in an 18 months later time skip, that follows the process of turning the Great Pacific Garbage Patch into a sovereign nation called New Texas, where Chaz gets to play at being a benevolent dictator, and he seeks recognition from the UN. And then there's an incoherent climax, mostly where he, I guess, proves his masculinity and technological mastery by facing off against a big game hunter whom he himself invited to the island, and then the guy tries to hunt him for sport. The comic ends with Chaz destroying the island as part of this hunt, but somehow claiming that that was his plan all along. The first issue really sets the tone. Chaz Worthington dreams of big things, solving bigger problems, and making his mark on the world. Only no one takes the 21-year-old heir to one of the biggest oil fortunes in history very seriously. That is, until he turns his back on his cushy life of wealth and privilege, and seeks to solve an environmental disaster twice the size of his native Texas, known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The epic sci-fi adventure and survival tale begins. As you can see from this description, Chaz is motivated by a combo of tech genius posturing and daddy issues. He wants to make his mark on the world, and environmental apocalypse is merely the backdrop for his exploits. A big problem that he sees as needing a quick science fiction techno fix. As a character, he's very quippy. He jokes about his status as a billionaire playboy anti-hero, calling himself an international playboy and spoiled rotten oil heir, in a way that I think is meant to be survived on persona. He gives a lot of really long info dump speeches, so he's very Atlas Shrugged by way of Tony Stark. He's a kind of Elon Musk type of character. He doesn't have any demonstrable skills. He sees himself as the smartest and most skilled person in any room, and he expresses this through a kind of edgelord humor most of the time. I was unsure when I started reading this if this was meant to be satire. As you can see from the dialogue, the comic is trying to be funny, but nothing about the way the comic narrative proceeds, the behind-the-scenes interviews that I found, or any marketing materials imply that I meant to take this as a satirical commentary on anything. In fact, the writer-creator Joe Harris is very upfront about the fact that we're supposed to like and root for Chaz. He says, Chaz has a noble heart but human frailties. He wants to solve this massive environmental problem, but he's going to do it his way and by his rules. He doesn't just mean clean up the patch, he means to conquer it. So this is explicitly a colonial project for Chaz. He's setting himself up as a colonial adventurer, and this is explicitly part of his dialogue. He talks about how risk comes with the territory, a very colonial narrative, a space for risky investment and self-actualization. He's going to be lord of all he surveys, master of truth.
I'm sorry, it's just, there's apparently a
His
loud
conquest
buzzing
of the
noise.
patch is a continuation of his personal family
On the
legacy
scene.
that spans from Texan oil to plastic waste that was oil produced. And this larger history text is set forth with American colonialism, Parkman's backstory and so on. One of the results of this framing of trash as a new colonial frontier for a new type of quippy, tech-savvy frontier hero is that any environmental messaging largely drops away from the comic itself. As the writer Joe Harris says, what excites me most about writing Great Pacific isn't necessarily the environmental message, or the chance to pile up some soapboxes to preach a cautionary tale. Rather, it's the story of one man mostly alone on this new strange frontier that gets me going. It's a story about exploration and survival, and persistence and triumph against all odds. The science fiction serves that arc, and the greater environmental message I hope is enhanced as a result. Or more succinctly in another interview, this isn't just some preachy call for conservation and recycling. With Great Pacific, I'm out to tell a pulse-pounding story of survival and adventure. And he's right. This is not a story of conservation or recycling at all. There is some environment in the comic, but only enough ecology to be exciting. It's an external force that Chaz can struggle against to prove himself a classic wilderness frontier. In its desire not to be preachy, the comic instead becomes what one of my colleagues call freewheeling masturbatory speculation. So, part 2. What is Chaz actually trying to do? Meet the hydrocarbon remediation operation, that's HERO for short. It's a plasma beam that can process crude oil, plastics, and complex hydrocarbons into water vapor, essentially removing the problem of waste entirely, dematerializing the material threat of trash. HERO can also reshape matter. A later explanation Chaz gives says that the HERO device pretty much eats hydrocarbons like plastic and transforms them into whatever state I want. So the HERO device is both a handheld gadget that gives Chaz extraordinary comic booky powers, at one point he shapes it into a platform he can stand on, and it's a large-scale infrastructure project that will clean up the patch. HERO is aptly named because the purpose is to establish Chaz as an inventor hero industrialist, although in appropriately kind of Elon Musk fashion, we don't actually know if Chaz invented anything himself or if he just paid for some researchers to invent HERO. It seems to be the case. We primarily see some scientists interacting with the HERO device on the garbage patch rather than Chaz himself, who's too busy talking to UN. He makes his motives for this project very clear. We've spent so much and made so much more, making the planet filthy with oil and garbage and plastic debris. Think about how much we could make cleaning it. Later he says, it doesn't take a bleeding heart to save the world, goddammit, it takes a profit motive. It's a very neoliberal fantasy. Every part of the commons becomes a space for further capitalist extraction. Education, water, now even plastic waste has been privatized. Chaz has to create a device in order to enclose the trash itself as a kind of capitalist room. A commons or a privately held investment. We would normally think of neoliberalism via the extraction of surplus value, not just for production, but also for circulation and consumption. This device also extracts surplus value from materials that have already been produced, circulated, and consumed. It's almost a perpetual motion fantasy for unlimited capitalist expansion. As a technological device to reshape and dematerialize the plastic waste, this device also creates a speculative analog to material history of plastic and plasticity. As Bernadette Vincent argues in Plastics, Materials, and the Means of Dematerialization, composites like synthetic polymers encourage the quest for the ideal material, with a structure in which each component would perform specific tasks according to the designer's project. Matter came to be presented as a malleable and docile partner of creation, a kind of Play-Doh in the hands of a clever designer who informs matter with intelligence and intentionality. Plastics connote this magic of indefinite metamorphosis to such a degree that they lose their substance, their materiality, to become virtual reality. They gradually come to epitomize a kind of dream world. And this is exactly what the HERO device does. It makes plastic even more plastic by fantastically reshaping and then dematerializing waste. This is a place where I'm interested in bringing Great Pacific together with Flotsam, the video game, because Flotsam similarly invites a player to fantastically reshape trash and plastics into a new floating city, and as a video game is able to play with this seeming substancelessness even more than the comic. In the comic, The hero device also connects this dream world fantasy of dematerialization to colonialism explicitly, in a way that's appropriate for the material histories of plastics and its multiple predecessor, rubber, both of which depend on colonialism for their cheap extraction and transportation. So now we get to a big question for this comic. Why are there natives on this trash island, and why are they a nuclear part of their cult? Colonialism is very much the point of the comic. It's a classic colonial adventure fiction by way of a libertarian what if I owned an island fantasy. But as a science fictional frontier, and as a trash frontier, Great Pacific had the perfect excuse to try to sidestep the issue of race as part of its world building. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is not actually an island, and no one lives there. Or do they? This background makes it very weird when in the first issue of the comic, this happens. Chast encounters an overdetermined racial stereotype. They can't communicate, and Chast shoots him. Something for which he never atones or even feels bad. This is later presented as justifiable. Both this moment and the larger presence of trash island natives only makes sense in the context of the comic's interest in colonial adventure fiction by way of the science fiction pulse. As he says, pirates, they make sense when taken in context with the indigenous tribal war party and downed Soviet-era spacecraft. You've met the pollution-addled mutant octopus already. All of these very different elements of world building are flattened together in the comic's logic. They exist because it's a fun trope that the writer has seen before. They are all categories of antagonists that show up in an adventure story. In other recent science fiction that's harkening back to early adventure fiction, the natives would normally be subtextually subsumed into a non-human antagonist. Jurassic Park is a lost world story, but there's only dinosaurs on the island. You could get abducted by aliens, but not these days usually a tribal war party. Great Pacific makes this subtext into text again, and in doing so puts settler colonialism front and center in its representation of ocean cleanup efforts. The explanation for who these people are raises more questions than answers. As their leader, who is the only woman and has no name, she's only referred to as Little Chief, explains they descended from some unnamed Pacific Islander nation. Their home was destroyed in an atomic weapons test. Where they've been living since World War II, I don't know, but it's interesting that the comic explicitly links nuclear weapons to plastic debris, not just in this backstory, but in the presence of Soviet-era satellite that is filled with nuclear warheads, which these trash island natives appropriate. They even set one off, destroying the US battleship in a weird reversal of historical weapons tests in the Pacific. While the comic is too racist and too inept in its portrayal of these characters to follow through on these connections, associating plastic waste with nuclear material identifies the ways that Pacific Islander nations and ocean ecologies often serve as a backdrop for narratives of white technological mastery across both of these examples. Ultimately, the natives decide that extinction is the only answer to living on a trashed planet. We were not meant to inherit this foul and troubled earth, my brothers, but we will have our revenge. This is just the opposite of actual indigenous activism around nuclear disarmament and climate change. It's a deeply racist and ignorant caricature that allows Chast to position himself as the benevolent hero who takes the nukes away from people who are too backwards and too burdened with their history to imagine a future. Indigenous futurism always takes the opposite perspective to this, finding survivance even on a post-apocalyptic trash world. But the comic's use of indigeneity is really bad, but it's also very telling. Pollutants are inextricable from the geopolitics of indigenous sovereignty and settler colonialism. Great Pacific makes these connections to colonial conquest and capitalist exploitation really obvious. But these motivations are implicit to a lot of white science fiction representations of pollution and a lot of well-intentioned science and environmental activism around ocean cleanup efforts. The Ocean Cleanup Project, for instance, mirrors some of the comic's language and its interest in a technological spectacle in much of its marketing. The CEO and founder, Brian Slatt, talks about himself as an inventor and entrepreneur who creates technologies to solve societal problems. He frames himself as a cool inventor CEO wearing t-shirts in a way that I find similar to Chaz Worthington. The project emphasizes cool technological gadgets over everything else. It talks about scaling up technologies with names like System 03 or the Interceptor. And the website prominently features pictures of sleek ships and airplanes deployed to scan and identify different forms of plastics, often from a distance. The next step for them apparently is also space satellite imaging. So it's a very top-down perspective. It's not dematerializing plastic per se, like a hero device, but as the website says at one point, this project is transforming plastic into data. For as much as the marketing materials emphasize that the patch is not actually an island, they also point out how cool it is that they're creating an artificial coastline. This is a kind of colonial island building fantasy, but one that went from CGI to IRL as a kind of playful gamified simulation of island building. The cleanup project is a nonprofit, but their corporate partners, I think, make it very clear that they're interested in cleaning up the ocean, but in a pro-capitalist way. We don't have to actually address the reasons why our world is overpolluted, especially when pollution can be such a profitable problem to the Coca-Cola company, for instance. And the Ocean Cleanup Project does also sell merch. They seem to have no clear collaborations with community efforts, or if they do, they aren't widely advertised as part of their materials. There's a brief blurb on the website attributed to ocean elders, but I have no way of knowing who these elders are, and they are significantly left unnamed. Instead, the very first celebrity endorsement that you see when you go to this website, instead comes from Elon Musk, which I think is very telling. As Max Warren points out in their book Pollution is Colonialism, you can't clean up plastics because they exist in geological time, and cleaning just shuffles them in space as they endure in time. You can't recycle them out of the way because it means even more will be produced, and there is no away at any rate. Plastics and their chemicals defy containment, a hallmark approach to industrial waste management, as they blow, flow, and off-gas so that their pollutants are ubiquitous in every environment tested. Last but hardly least, their long temporality means that their future efforts are largely unknown, making uncertain the guarantee of settler futures. Pollution is colonialism, but as Warren points out, and as Great Pacific and Flotsam demonstrate, environmental cleanup efforts are often also very colonial in their rhetoric or actions. Ultimately, I'm interested in texts like Great Pacific because they reveal these connections between waste management, colonial control, and capitalist speculation that structure the rhetoric of environmental cleanup projects. Across all of these texts, the patch is a frontier for playful speculation and profit, and its plasticity only lends itself to this fantasy of infinitely repurposable, dematerialized waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is actually not able to be with us, but I'm going to play her presentation. It's Lisa Yin Han, who's Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies at Arizona State University. Her book project, Deep Water Alchemy, Extractive Mediation and the Taming of the Seafloor, examines how media operations in deep ocean environments pave the way for extractive industry. Lisa has also published work on abortion media, internet freedom, and environmental media in journals such as Media Plus Environment, Communication, Culture, and Critique, and Contraception. She's an affiliate with the Humanities for Environment North America and Asia Pacific Observatories, and hopefully people online can tell me what the sound is like when I start to play this.
Hello everybody, my name is Lisa Yin Han, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. I really apologize for not being able to meet you all in person, but I want to tell you a little bit about my project today, which is entitled Waste Eaters, Autonomous Cleaners, Metabolic Machines, and Remediation of Water. There's a new kind of predator swimming in the rivers, canals, and harbors of Hong Kong, Florida, Rotterdam, and Singapore, and its territory is increasing. It goes by a few different names: the clearbot, the lake shark, the sea cow, the jellyfish bot. But each species serves a similar purpose: to clean up human trash, plastic, invasive species, and stuff from our waterways autonomously. So in this project, I attempt to think about what is enabled and what is lost, socially, politically, and economically, in implementation of these animalistic waste machines. Are these metabolic cleaners truly a form of logical AI, as the developers tell us, or is this bioengineering merely an artifice that circumvents structural and ecological issues at hand? My approach, informed by multi-species ethnographies, infrastructural perspectives, and theoretical work in environmental human studies, attempts to answer this by unpacking the terms by which we define the waste realm's autonomy, as well as how it is situated within existing ecologies of waste and infrastructure. So in particular, I'm going to start by examining the waste fishes deployed by Arizona's water utility company, Saltwater Project, or SRP for short, and then moving to international waste spots like the waste shark and clearbot that are envisioned to service community features on a larger scale. Several of these robot developers directly claim to be addressing ocean plastic pollution by clearing large swaths of litter before they reach the ocean's plastic giants. Waste drone developers are implying a certain kind of return to this purity-oriented model of environmental remediation. In addition, waste drones reflect a broader Eurocentric cultural fixation on hierarchies of consumption as the terrain where human consumptionalism is both reified and challenged. So names like wake shark bring to mind decades of ocean filmmaking that has centered predator-prey relationships, images of great whites, gaping mouths and rows of teeth, and of course the evolutionary iconography of big fishes eating little fish. My thesis is ultimately that these infrastructural trash eaters become part of a system of extractive remediation, which seeks to optimize nature for profit. By creating company machines that resemble nature, but yet are simultaneously posited as external to existing ecologies, autonomous waste eaters attempt to circumvent the social inequalities that are produced through refuse, the unfettered production of disposable consumer goods, the human activities that transport invasive species, and the material challenges of how waste moves, breaks down sediments, and becomes entangled with stuff that we value. I'll start with an anecdote. So last summer, I went on a tour of Venus's Granite Reef Diversion Dam with SRP environmental scientist Ronnie Moorhead, who generously walked me through the maintenance infrastructure and the canals that make up Arizona's unique water supply and distribution system. So both non-living and living agents are managed, from the sandbars that form from sediment silt to the weeds that crop up and choke the flow of water. The Granite Reef Diversion Dam operates by a very anti-sedimentary logic of remediation, as it controls and partitions out the movements of fish, water, weed, and sediment. As Stephanie Lemegere puts it, quote, extractivism means, among other things, abstraction, which is time-saving and aesthetically clean, no sedimentary harm. Just as forgetting is time-saving and aesthetically clean. To sediment must be an act against the anti-materialism of power, end quote. So indeed, most of the canal's infrastructural maintenance revolves around this efficient separation of matters. But of course, life is unruly, the degree to which any ecological stasis is achieved is never fully certain. And I think that there's no better place to witness the struggle than in the story of the canal's fishes. So in the Arizona canals, invasive fish species like striped bass, which were introduced to this ecosystem by sports fishermen in the 1970s, and flathead catfish are prevented from spreading further through the deployment of electric fish barriers, which essentially act as interspecies border infrastructures. Meanwhile, marine economies, filamentous algae, and chara periodically form and are eaten by purposefully introduced white ombers, which is a species of minnow also known as the grass carp, affectionately referred to on SRP's website as their smallest employees. In the Anthropocene, carp of all kinds have formed interestingly close couplings with human infrastructures. For example, Sebastian Loretta and Patricio Flores explain that the resilience of carp makes them one of the most extensively invasive fish species worldwide. So much so that common carp are even found in the toxic mining tailings of Chile's Grand Dam. Fly fishermen often describe carp as trash fish, full of bones and tasting of blood. So, from an environmental humanist perspective, It's a colonial artifact here in the global north to conflate waste with what wasted and with not productivity for the accumulation of capital, right? So, in a twisted way, it makes sense that a notorious trash fish that neglects itself much would be repurposed to eat up other species that would be as scum. The irony being, of course, that a trash fish could become, by virtue of eating trash, less trashy to the human subjects. The white otter originates from the Amur River in the Siberia border and was imported to the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s to keep aquaculture facilities clean. SRP began their own white otter program around 1990, and today there are roughly 44,000 white otters that cleanse the state's water supply. With the program comes a PR campaign. So one particular article of interest pits the white otter against blacker mussels. The subheadings read, quote, white otter, these fish are our friends, and black mussels are foes. Describing carp as hardy aquatic animals capable of consuming up to 3/4 of their body daily in meat and algae. Quackers, on the other hand, are given the delivery. The city of Phoenix buys their sterilized white otter employees from farms in Arkansas and Oklahoma to ensure that they don't reproduce. U.S. Fish and Wildlife collects the eggs and sperm of deployed males and pressures them in a steel cylinder where induced cellular disease to the development of a third set of chromosomes, resulting in sterile triploid fish. In this way, white otters become ideal laborers, really drones, technologically controlled and reduced in metabolic functions and cost-saving performances, a job very much like roadside servicing. From this remediation of trash fish to trashing machines, then arises notions of autonomy, replacement of human labor, and a vision for optimized nature. So it is worth considering how the white otters use is part of a genealogy that ultimately includes as a logical endpoint the large-scale deployment of autonomous waste drones. In 2018, inspired perhaps by the success of the leading fishes, SRP partnered with ASU Professor Dan Haas and the IDEA Lab, stands for the Integrated Design, Engineering, and Analysis Lab, to prototype a robotic fish for the use of cleaning out the narrow 15-mile lateral pipes at the margins of our water system. Haas's lab specializes in building robots with cheap and flexible materials that can be accessibly mass-produced and scaled for industrial use. So he got this opportunity to essentially create an alternative to the chemical solutions that are currently used. Ultimately, the FishBot project never really went beyond the prototype, but other waste robots are being implemented. So, Randmarie's Waste Shark, which is based in the Netherlands, is a battery-powered drone inspired by the whale shark, designed to, quote, take a bite out of water pollution. It also has a few competitors, including Open Ocean Engineering's ClearBot, which is a Hong Kong-based project that brands itself specifically to Asian countries, and the Jellyfish Bot, which is an AI-powered drone, more recently designed by the Max Planck Institute. So let's talk a little bit about the autonomy of these systems. Autonomy is a historically contingent concept that is not so much an essence, right, as it is a collection of ideas enacted through discourse and material practice. So within the waste drone assemblage, autonomy implies a couple of different things, including the removal or reduction of human labor, self-optimization, and productivity. ClearBot, for instance, follows and continuously expands upon a database of trash that helps it visually identify useful wildlife while adjusting to limited currents. You have one camera that monitors the water surface and circuits for trash and obstacles. Then a second camera photographs every piece of trash that comes across the conveyor belt, and then it sends it to the Microsoft Azure platform. Randmarie's Waste Shark, which uses the layout technologies intelligent autonomous systems, works similarly and is described on the website as being able to work 24/7 without human intervention. This fantasy of autonomy from humans has a few holes in it. So, for instance, for the AI subject, notions of autonomy tend to include ideas of reasoning or self-governance, but discount political positionalities beyond an ideal self-possessed liberal subject. As scholars, including Joseph Flynn, Portland Spillers, and others have pointed out, lived realities of autonomy are structured in large part by social systems of oppression, as the capacity for self-governance is differentially experienced, right? Especially in relation to things like race, sexuality, ability, and class. Such questions of social power and oppression cannot be circumvented by gestures toward artificial intelligence. Waystreams are employing roles that are informed by these same social relations of power. In addition, as digital experts such as Sally Noble and Benjamin and others have demonstrated, algorithms embed social biases in their very design. So the other salient point is that technology theorist Maya Ganesh argues that the inherent marginalization of the human in autonomous systems reflects a changing economic relationship rather than outright evil, resulting in a shifting of human laborers to more vulnerable, minimally rewarding work functions. And that is very, very much true here. Once the waste is collected by the bots, Grandmarine's website gestures towards the fact that it is up to human operators to remove and dispose of the waste, as though this human labor is merely an afterthought and not an integral part of Grandmarine's visions or the waste truck operations. One can only assume that what happens once the trash is removed is likely the same as what happens to all the rest of the trash that we throw away, right? Like it is dumped, it's incinerated, it's salvaged, or otherwise dealt with by poor and marginalized communities, largely in the global south. So this leads me to the first and most obvious feature of these technologies, which is that the transformation of our waste into an essential food or flow for the waste shark allows for the continued proliferation of waste sinks by naturalizing the presence of robots as digestive agents, while taking focus away from the continued production and consumption of plastics and other toxic waste, and the continued necessity of vulnerable salvage work. So waste streams are really a pretty machinery that makes the production of residues visible to aquaculture communities to the detriment. In addition, despite their marketing as predators or employees, waste sharks and white armor also are disposable subjects, mirroring the social disposability of not only recyclers and salvagers around the world, but also the communities that are disproportionately exposed to toxins in the water they consume. To underscore that bottom feeder status, the ASU researchers on the Fishbot project emphasized that one of the main variables that informed the prototype was its capacity for destroyability without significant monetary loss. Professor Alves actually admitted to me that this proliferation of disposable robots and disposable drones was itself cause for environmental concern, given that as others comprise of composite fiber and plastics, they are fated to become part of the waste problem. So going back to the question of what is enabled, I suspect that the metaphor of hunger and feeding encourages us to extrapolate an ecological and metabolic imaginary of nature in order to support a regime of human capitalism. Unlike actual fishes, however, robot fishes never get full, their populations are not ecologically either. And when I think of hungry machines that are never full, one of the first things I think of is the way this imagery has been localized in Marxist critiques of destructive capitalism. This goes hand in hand with critiques of corporate AI. James Bridle has contended that AI is, quote, driven by the logic of contemporary capitalism and the energy requirements of computation itself, adding that, quote, the deepest need of AI in the present era is the fuel for its own expansion. So hunger here becomes extracted in more ways than one. But while it may be eating machines, waste sharks and white armors exist in the absence of the many other drives and desires that inform how living beings couple with their environments and with each other. To reduce an environment to fuel, to reduce life to hunger and hunger to hierarchy, limits the possibilities for seeing life, resource, growth, and ecology. As such, I think we need to be thinking about these trash fishes not as autonomous swimmers, but as agents that actively depend on, share, and also define the groups that they are placed in. There are many sources of inspiration for how we might imagine a coupling for our waste environments. Even Disney had a more expansive imagination in its character of Wall-E, which is being created to tidy up a futuristic Earth choked by garbage. As a fictional waste collecting robot, Wall-E's intelligence and autonomy manifests its ability to redefine what isn't trash based on subjective desires and judgments rather than pre-planned directives. So more than one way, an environment of waste informs the waste creator's sense of self and autonomy, and vice versa. Perhaps we ought to be exploring our capacities for waste remediation, as well as the capacities for waste to remediate us, to make human waste, right? Rather than employees or enemies of weeds, plastics, and trash fish too. Thank you very much.
That was great. Okay, let's see if we can. If this is going to work. No, I think I only have your.
No, I think no. I think if you go up on the slideshow thing, you see play from start.
Oh, I'm going to have to, you know what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to have to stop my share and actually play your slideshow rather than this one to get that.
Because yeah, I've checked and it should just play the whole thing and change automatically.
Is this? Okay, then I'm going to share screen, desktop 2, share, and then
Oh yeah.
play from start is where?
If you go to slideshow on the in one of the option on there's insert, draw, design, transitions, animations, slideshow. Yeah. And right to the left, play from start. Yeah.
Hi everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm very much looking forward to discussing on it. My name is Isabella, and my research is about the critical articulation of knowledge in waste. Today I'll explore how a new paradigm in climate science is transforming the way we think about planetary waste, regulating climate mitigation strategies and climate justice, and then using power in new planetary reality for technoscale. I will do so by looking at Earth system science and placing it on CO2 experiments conducted in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s, which I consider to be an early attempt to achieve a unified understanding of the Earth as a materially closed and self-regulated system. A system that needs to continuously recycle its own waste to function properly. I will show that this case provides insight into the contradictions and self-critical tensions that could stem from the ambiguous and strict logic of the biosphere's microscopic fluids, which I will explain in a little bit. I have embarked on this path at a time when more and more critical theorists and STS scholars are resorting to expressions, concepts, and models derived from science that whose corresponding issues and ontologies are not always fully recognized, and which, by the same token, leave unsuitable for the study of historical forces and crises. To give context, not too long ago, I attended a conference in Paris, in Italy, where the keynote was given by Paul Andrews, an STS scholar who spoke on value. One after the other, he presented a series of figures and statistics telling us that it is perhaps already too late, that we, then by that time, anthropos, were now being digested by the CO2 emitting technometabolism of the Anthropocene. Metabolism rapidly evolving in the future, causing all the set boundaries for a safe operating space. Such is now the way that we communicate climate change. Striking numbers of drop lines studied by study ends here. I was surprised by the kind of reading that came near this talk, which called for an embrace of the Earth system geological history to better grasp and address the user life of atmosphere. I was growing like the world on the surface, eating away life. But amidst the urgency, there is no sign of justice. Only a system of cycles and series. To understand the reason why these terms are so prevalent, one must understand the history and impact of Earth system science, biological science, critically predicting the behavior of human organisms. Experiments which increasingly provided large sets of data to environmental scientists. This was the birth of cybernetics. Of course, a number of other impactful political and scientific advancements and publications followed, such as NASA's Apollo missions and Mediating Ecologies, which set the stage for the census known as well. That is, as a second recognition revolution, as some scientists are calling it. Rather than situating the Earth within an infinite universe, this new paradigmatic shift reverses our gaze back at the planet, defined as a single and complex organism. This second revolution relied on the creation of a new set of tools called microscopes, which, far from amplifying what is too broad and too small, create an objective distance from which to observe the increasing complexity and number of interacting systems. As explained by scientist Joy, the microscope is unlike other tools. It is a symbolic instrument made of a number of methods accompanied scale of very different disciplines. It would be useless to search for it in modern tools, research science, yet countless companies use it in these very tools. The microscope can be considered a symbol of a new way of seeing, understanding, and acting. The filter details, he adds, amplify relations that are incommensurable to human sensory scales. It might include any combinations of sensors and satellites keeping in mind or even the heuristic reproduction of ecosystems at smaller scales, while the Biosphere 2 experiment. In the context of this historical convergence between cybernetics and space exploration, ESS Pickering and David Turner explains that this new science's goal is to evaluate how and whether humanity is capable of extending the evolution of complexity to a new level, that of a sustainable and technology civilization. The Earth is thus at once its object and its laboratory, a very set of multi-scale experiments and analytics aiming to understand harmful interactions by cycles, technology, and humans. By finding new ways to tell the story of Earth's evolution and work toward a more sustainable future, ESS is thus finding a planetary future, framed by the circular scenario, in which the Earth must be defined. This narrative comes the writings of historian Prakash Chakrabarty on the concept of a planetary future, this emerging object category that challenges human-centric views of the world by splitting humanity into two levels of analysis, that of an emergent geological force and that of a situated person struggling with it. Chakrabarty's call for a new category of a planetary stems from the recognition that human history always relied on the multiplicity of complexity, terrestrial processes, etc. that keep us alive while unfolding at incommensurable and non-human scales, those of Earth's systems. She writes, my particular concern has been to figure out what the implications of science climate change in the Earth's system science could be for humanists interested in thinking about the historical time towards the Earth. In fact, Chakrabarty and many other researchers clearly consider the ESS to be a privileged framework for understanding not just climate change, but climate justice and humans. As we are seeing, this framework proceeds from a somewhat pre-cybernetic approach that has found new emerging planetary agency called capitalism. To fashion this concept of techno-capitalism, Edwards relied on geoscientist Peter's concept of genes, which dates from another work by in 2014. Although the term technosphere is not older, calculated ontological consistency, defining it as a set of technologies and infrastructures that feed on fossil fuels and other energy sources, emerging as a geological paradigm similar to the lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere. The technosphere is an emergent and complex large-scale phenomenon that bears its own dynamic and has a planetary agency, becoming aware through its human components of what is essential to its own existence, a sort of transcendental agency From this perspective, technology has not only become a condition of life, but functions as an autonomous system that must be preserved from the outside, from a non-anthropocentric perspective. The problem is, as a sphere analogous to the biosphere, which continually recycles oxygen and carbon, for example, the atmosphere repeatedly fails to recycle its own waste. In a closed system like that of the Earth and factories, every metabolizing system must recycle its own waste. But perhaps, he writes, technology's failure is a consequence of its status as a mutuological phenomenon. That is, technology might just be at the beginning of a process in which it is learning to recycle emissions and pollutants more effectively. When talking about climate change mitigation strategies, half often uses expressions which give surprising agency to this autonomous sphere. For example, the carbon tax empowers resistance, he says, because technology has evolved into mechanisms for its own decrease. This imposes the conclusion that trying to reduce the excessive use of energy or matter might be useless. He compares the atmosphere to a thermal engine, a theoretical heat engine, claiming that whatever work is done by a system, additional energy is required to power the recycling mechanism. The autonomous technosphere must thus develop those mechanisms, which it would have to do by using not less, but more energy. For Peter Huff, technology might ultimately fail, and if humans were to extinct, then the technosphere would have been but one episode of the Earth's history. But if some humans remain as a stress but surviving population, then technology may evolve in something we can't predict or even imagine. In other words, whatever we humans decide through our cultural and political institutions, we must remain aware that the framework for our decisions will always be very driven by the human and technosphere states, but whose needs should be prioritized, the story doesn't say. When I read texts from scientific authorities in climate change science who are increasingly excited by climate scholars like something doesn't sit right. As scientist historians Deborah Cohen and Frederick Johnson have written, ESS is often witness to the historical forces that shape the responses to the environment. This is because it pretends to analytically encompass and integrate social and natural systems. But the means of this integration are often purely cognitive, driven by unacknowledged cultural biases and ideas. I'd like to question ESS's sway over our ability to imagine more just futures by focusing on one essential instance, waste management. As much as Hamer and Amy Gavin theoretically have written, the Earth system as a new ontological category involved the connection and conflation of science and governance. Scientists, the builders of the Earth system, fabricated two concepts in common: a system of knowledge production and a system of knowledge input. Perhaps one must reverse yet again Shankar-Bard's gesture and examine the situated human history of science used to understand and design and fix future planetary processes at scales that seem to be predetermined. This is what the biosphere too is for. Last March, I traveled to study with Arizona to visit biosphere too. We spent 5 days touring the local area, talking to the community, and visiting the various places that make up its culture and natural landscape. But perhaps what was most disconcerting to me was the strange coexistence of fascination that I felt in the face of these glowing, sweeping lines, glistening in the sunlight, but revealing the opaque viscous and vast universe as soon as I moved to the glass. Were people still taking the care of the plants? How often did they feed windows? He asked. I based most of this very preliminary analysis and field observations on the information gathered from talking to people. So for the purpose of this presentation, I mostly stick to what I observed. Biosphere 2 was built from 1987 to 1991 in Old, Arizona, and imagined by an executive director led by John P. Allen, an admirer of Governance before he was operating natural restoration group. symbolizing our civilization. Alan saw this as a way to rebuild civilization, a new frontier of civilization built in the ruins of the world. Biosphere 2 is conceived both as a spectacle and as a scientific experiment, testing the technological possibility of living on another planet, or at least that's the sensational story we were told. An ambitious endeavor fundamentalized in the headline. In so many ways, it was a corporate enterprise whose goal was to create a second biosphere that was the first one the Earth developed. As such, each chosen biosphere is lived in the sealed habitat for 2 years from 1991 to 1992, relying on foodstuffs, agriculture, waste management to survive. Air, water, food, excrement, everything had to be recycled and transported to the coast. Today, the facility houses an Earth system science laboratory associated with the University of Arizona and is open to public tours. The Biosphere 2 experiment was and still is a microscope, which technologically reproduces some of the Earth's habitats: rainforests, agricultural lands, desert, the savanna, the marsh, and the ocean. It included different trophic levels, plants, herbivores, mammals, all that in one closed system to better understand how they impacted the world consistent ecology. To do this, they called on a number of experts who drew up tailor-made lists of species of corals, plants, trees, insects, and animals that would live and thrive alongside humans. And after that, they scoured the world to capture the carbon stuff. It was a tedious job because every organism and human structure had to be treated and checked to make sure it wasn't contaminated. But even if the biosphere was built to last 100 years, many species can be realistically survive in such restricted spaces and ecosystems. Perhaps the goal was best to reproduce or to understand, adapt, and survive. For the biospheres, this was an opportunity to do experimental science of cybernetic, that is, predicting and analyzing the community data, adapting to prepare us for a potential future. This was problem solving in a relentless feedback loop. As a microscope, the structure was conceived as a telescope, as it was originally called, comprising an energy center along with an inside underground complex, controlling and regulating all flows of information. As a closed system, the only inputs and outputs possible were those of information. A control center located outside the inverter, constantly monitoring, observing participants, habitats, and others. The biospheres would communicate with them, and at times with their farms. Besides, energy is also essential in enabling plants and soils to breathe and to process greater quantities of CO2, which contain carbon. In fact, the key and most notorious failure of the project, which led to a controversy and loss of public credibility, was the drastic increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which proved the real danger to biospheres. One of the spikes was explained when we discovered that someone had mistakenly left a garden control in their home in a compost pile, feeding bacteria which then produce unanticipated, excessive amounts of CO2. While this helped them understand better how miscalculated the overall role of bacteria in the ecosystem, the control center eventually had to intervene and inject oxygen to stabilize levels, and this led to the problem. To keep the plant viable, electricity is also needed to power the air conditioning, as 30 minutes without it would have led to dramatic injuries. They also had to power around two Tesla sensors that were able to monitor and study system functions. That electricity came from fossil fuel, which obviously is not extracted from produced on site. This is the extra energy and gas GHG emissions that HAFS is expecting the atmosphere to require in order to recycle its waste. While the Biosphere 2 had discovered this is not the case of Biosphere 1. Obviously, the Biosphere is species that inhabit the space were the hardest hit by the external story of the within the cybernetic logistical framework that is global development countries. And yet, this is what ESS's fundamental assumption was, or is. In my view, the experiment embodies this second revolution in scientific methodology, while its energy and waste management strategy tests the fallacies of the closed system. Earth system science considers the Earth's final historical stage as a process necessary for technological development. Reflecting on the Earth's evolution, David Turner writes, we might imagine a nuclear phase in which mining forms manage the biosphere global by geochemical cycles, in effect building a sustainable high-technology global civilization. Biosphere 2 is relatively essential at this time of its history. I'd now like to underline some of the main points I see in the story. First, Glenn Edwards and Chakrabarty rely on the concept of potency, but are not just referring to the materiality and environmental cost involved in automatic structures and tools. As experienced, the atmosphere is imagined as a figure whose power threatens the survival of humans. The work is also a metaphor for a world of planetary governments whose cultural and economic determinants are continually obscured by the figure of this emerging ethical scene of capitalism, operating at a scale so enormous it risks giving rise to a sense of disintelligence and planetary. If the definition of an organism's boundaries is a set of political governance as telling the gap of will with the world's boundary, then we might ask what forms of governance are associated with the ESS knowledge and benefits of the Earth system as a post-cybernetic system. And what alternative worldviews might be satisfied to inform political system includes that one of the first characteristics of such politics in the planetary scale is perhaps most obviously the immediate agency of responsibility for the hands of those who actually have most of the power of this planet. I'm not saying that each and every one of us can control each and every one of the technologies that regulate our lives, but I'm saying that conferring ontological primacy to an agency that acts autonomously on a scale that completely eclipses human politics is a fallacy that rests on false analogy. That is, the belief that because technology operates on a global scale, it necessarily becomes equivalent to other planetary spheres. As Half explains, organic recycling mechanisms, he assumes that the atmosphere itself represents the same nature properties, except that it is merely fair. His discourse encourages us to imagine technological solutions to this recycling process, and by doing so, confronts the political and economic modes of human recycling with the organic processes of plants. Moreover, he is to say that recycling is the only waste reduction strategy. Perhaps by trying to integrate so closely and historically human and earthly processes, ESS misses some of the fundamental differences between them. Differences based on power dynamics, cultural norms, and historical forces of globalization. All of these are informed by the global assumptions and practices behind the creation of the second biosphere, which consider the Earth to be a entity in useful economies, but upon whose lands and with whose resources will we build this civilization. Finally, my greatest concern, stemming from the story of knowledge politics, is the ambiguous and divided logic of an understanding piece, or the impossible to dialogue with a cybernetic and distinct positionality, at once internal and external, centralized and decentralized, that enable the management and control of biosphere 2. As Heyman and Alhambra Manico explained, while ESS claims that its tools can effectively integrate the complexity of natural and social worlds by creating decentralized and interdisciplinary knowledge development, it relies on a specific historical era whose fundamental assumptions and logics figure to enable governance based on central control, like biosphere 2's central command center located outside the ecosystem. Perhaps we are faced with a different, more ambiguous logic that now first described in central technologies, though perhaps it's exactly the same thing. While some thing that ISO2 fell using real biosphere because its atmosphere could never replicate the scale and functionality of a real emergent atmosphere, as means an atmosphere whose center is everywhere because circumference is nowhere. I would say to the argument that there is a fundamental ethical problem in the assumption that one should eliminate such a problem, as well as an ethical problem to the idea that such an inside positionality is desirable for production and changing business strategies. Or at least it should be problematized and acknowledged. That's what I think I'm going to do. Thank you for listening and for your attention. And I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. These were such compelling papers, and at the end of the slideshow, let's see what I can do. Can I move this over here? I'm trying to just make sure that I can give put all of you onto the main screen here. I know that we're kind of over time. I just want to make sure that I can. I think there isn't. Okay, so now I've put you on the main screen. And I don't see Isabelle. There you are. Thank you. This was so rich and interesting and fascinating. I think there were so many connections around the human and the non-human entanglements in and through the technological mediations of scenes of environmental destruction across all papers. And what I found really striking were a series of metaphors, particularly or concept terms around questions of labor, and especially non-human labor, and how that emerged in these different papers, and how that entangled questions of agency and also questions of energy in ways that I think are really interesting. I was really interested in the epistemologies of remediation and systems thinking that we're very often using kind of metabolic metaphors in Lisa's paper as well as in Isabelle's and sort of in Stina's as well around this garbage patch. So I think that's kind of interesting thread to maybe unpack. And then there was a really interesting set of like border infrastructures and thresholds that was something that we might kind of interestingly and generatively think about together. So those were some of the themes that I saw across all these papers, but I really want to open it up to questions and comments and allow us to have a little bit of time to respond to each other. I'm going to put the chat here so that I can see if there are questions from the audience, but are there questions from the audience in the room? And if you do have a question, maybe you can come up here to ask it so that the people on screen can actually see you. Yeah, do you want to come?
Hi, I can't see you, so I'll just act like you're in front of me. Thank you for this panel, everyone. It was just such a, as you say, so many threads connecting. And to me, so many of these threads are, my name is Lindsay. Hi. So many of these threads are metabolic threads. I'm thinking of von Liebig, who, the Western father of phosphate, who described Britain as a ghoul soaking up this quest to eat the phosphate of the world. And it strikes me there is this visual thread running through many of these papers around the white color. And I was wondering if the bleaching of coral, the phosphate, the white plastic, and then this discourse in climate mitigation around the albedo effect and how whiteness can help with climate change and some of those tensions around that, around climate crisis. I was also thinking wasting. I might not actually have a question, I might just be saying stuff, but I was also thinking wasting through the body as well, and through the cachexia is the metabolic disorder of the body eating itself and wasting away, and how wasting might be thought of through a body in that sense. And just thank you for for this really rich, these rich stories all together. I just appreciated this very much, and wasting, pulling through all of this really mattered. I don't think, oh, we were just asking Yuri if you wanted to say anything because of the corals. And maybe I'll also plug, there's a cool exhibition by Katarina Tewa here in Honolulu, the Project Banaba work. Yes.
I wish if I were there to see the exhibit. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Very quickly, yes. If I had more time, I wanted to mention the whole research by the Odoms brothers about the symbiosis between coral and algae was basically a metabolic trophic, what they call trophic structure of the coral reef as a closed ecosystem. And that drew on the preceding Japanese scientists' work on coral symbiosis. So I wanted to link that to a kind of Marxist, ecological Marxist critique of the metabolic rift, which is often associated with the excessive mining of guano and phosphate ore, and how that, again, like thinking about how the waste is transformed into wealth, right? So the metaphor of white gold, I think, is apt here. And yeah, I don't want to say too much, but I just wanted to mention the whiteness is also, I guess, it's literally the white colonial forces. But I want to mention, as someone who's a descendant of Japanese settler family, the colonial force is not just white, but also Japanese as well.
Isabelle, do you want to add something? Because there's so much of what you're dealing with ESS, and particularly with the biosphere too, has to do with these metabolic processes. And Lindsay, just to contextualize, has just written a book called After Eating that's about metabolic processes, and it's really excellent.
No, I had nothing that came in mind just now. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Is there another question or any questions in the chat? Stina, maybe, there was such a difference in your paper because you were really talking about imaginaries and the ways in which a particular set of ideologies were really informing the kind of structures of like waste removal, and that connects with Lisa's, even though Lisa isn't able to make it here. But I think there's something really important about the epistemologies that are being played out, or the fantasies, really conservative fantasies that are being played out in this garbage patch comic book that might really relate to some of the most conservative kind of waste disposal imaginaries that are also part of systems thinking and other kinds of like imaginaries of waste and disposability.
Yeah, I think I knew that my talk would pair nicely with Lisa's, but from what I could understand of the other ones and the sound wasn't always clear. There were some really great connections with all the other ones. I think especially in the context of wasting and thinking about kind of the power dynamics of kind of sapping value and leaving things sort of wasted. It's interesting that the comic book is imagining a version of that where waste itself can be transformed into nothingness, and there is no waste byproduct of that, as a kind of speculative project in a science fiction way, but also speculative capital. But I think all of your other work about like the real actual situatedness of different sites of waste are pointing out very much that that's always going to be a fantasy, but I think a powerful fantasy, especially for some of these kinds of startups.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Well, it's not a question, but just one thing that I thought really interestingly.
Can you come up, because I don't think they can hear you. I know, I'm sorry, Estrida. It's just that then I'll have to repeat and summarize.
It's a comment and not even a question, so I feel like that's not fair to come up and, but that, Krista tied your paper to Lisa's. I don't know if you have heard the story, it's such a sad story, but of the whale that was found with an entire greenhouse from southern Spain in its belly. And so this idea of the waste-eating marine creature, like kind of being the real materialization of the connection between the hubris of Lisa's presentation and what you're talking about, what happens to all of this sea of plastic, like what actually ends up consuming it, It's just, anyways, if anyone wants to comment on that, please feel free.
There's some documentaries that show the kind of waste landscapes of the sea of plastic, and they show the ways in which the plastic, because the plastic sheeting is like 3-level polyethylene, and it disintegrates so quickly, but it blows away. So even if it gets dumped into dump sites, it then sort of like just gets dispersed across the landscape, and the landscape is pretty dry and arid. And then the ramblas that used to have the water running through it, the sheets of the plastic get embedded in the strata of the dust and dirt. So you see dirt, plastic, dirt, plastic, dirt, plastic in these ramblas. And then what's been happening because of the pollution of the aquifers and the draining of the aquifers and salination of the aquifers is that when rainstorms are happening, they kind of don't replenish the aquifers. They run across these landscapes and they carry the plastic into the sea. And then you get into exactly the microplastic pollution that Liboron's talking about, that's invisible, that's not the garbage patch, that gets ingested, and not even ingested as an entire greenhouse, but just ingested within the whole ecosystem of microplastics in the world. And so when we're talking about a sea of plastic, we're also really talking about the sea of plastic. And I'm kind of interested in the fact that the ideological work that the sea of plastic as an image of this landscape is doing is really obscuring where that sea of plastic is actually located and what's toxic about it. So that there are like environmental technical journals that say actually it's really good because its whiteness is actually reflecting the sun, so it's helping to cool down this area, which is a really hot area, and so it's actually environmentally very sound because it's a reflective surface, right? Which is like completely obscuring what's happening beneath that. And a lot of the literatures are now really just trying to say like it's even more profitable to stay in southern Spain and begin to use climate control than to grow things in the Netherlands, even if you're shipping at 500 kilometers, because it's warmer there. And so we're going to continue to do that. But that's all within these logics of global agribusiness that are really implanting this kind of form of intensive agriculture everywhere, and blueprinting like temporary foreign worker programs and really precaritized labor conditions. There's a whole side industry of construction. So in the off season, undocumented or rendered undocumented laborers are often working in construction, and the construction is really unskilled and flimsy, and people are prone to injury all the time because they're building these really makeshift temporary structures, and they're not skilled labor. So that kind of process of laying to waste through really increasing forms of precarity is, I think, a story that's coming across all of these, with the deep histories of toxic effects that go well beyond the scale of the human, in ways that I think are really consonant with what Yuri's showing because of the historical nature of your case study. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about as well. I know we've gone over. I think what I'm going to suggest is that we stop this now, but let's try and continue this conversation among these papers, because I think there's so much more we can say, unless there's anything else that people want to respond to in each other's papers. I know we've gone well over. Okay. Thank you all for being here at the end of the conference, for everybody's patience with the audio. I know it was not easy to run these bimodally and keep everything clean in terms of audiovisual. Thank you for your patience, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Krista, for running this.